"Don't open it, please," the girl whispered, her voice breaking. The rough rope was biting into her wrists. Her hair fell across her face, a tangled mess of brown and dust. The crowd pressed closer, their boots kicking up clouds of grit around the auction block where she knelt. She trembled, a burlap sack pulled low over her head. Its seams were stained, frayed, the smell of old grain clinging to it like shame itself had been woven right into the threads. The tall cowboy stepped forward. A single coin flashed in his palm. The auctioneer laughed, a loud, booming sound that carried across the whole square. "You don't want this one, stranger. Not worth a cent. Not worth a glance." The people laughed with him. Children pointed and snickered. The town's women shook their heads, pulling their shawls tighter. But the cowboy said nothing. He just dropped the coin into the auctioneer's open hand. His gaze was fixed, locked on the trembling, hooded figure at his feet. He knelt down, his fingers calloused and sure, reaching for the rough knot that bound the sack around her neck. She cried out again, her voice sharp with a primal fear. "Don't open it!" The crowd leaned in, a wave of bodies hungry for a spectacle. Their whispers hissed like snakes in dry grass. "Hideous," one of them muttered. "Cursed," said another. Still the cowboy pulled at the knot, his fingers working patiently, tugging until the rope finally fell loose. And slowly, ignoring her ragged sobs, he lifted the sack. The fabric slid away, and in that instant, every single jeer fell silent. The entire square went quiet. The face beneath was not monstrous. It was marked by ugly bruises, her cheekbones swollen and purple, her lips split clean through. Her skin was pale from nights without sleep, from days without sun. But her eyes blazed with defiance. They were eyes that dared anyone, anyone at all, to laugh now. The square held its breath, all except for one voice. A man's voice, sharp and furious, cutting through the silence with a roar. "Not her!" Heads whipped around. A rival rancher was pushing his way through the crowd, shoving people aside. His fists were clenched, his heavy boots pounding against the wooden boards as if he could drag her back by force alone. The girl's eyes widened in pure terror, and the cowboy rose slowly to his full height, the torn sack falling from his hand into the dust at his feet. Elias Red Feather. I have walked the squares of many towns, and I have seen shame sold as easily as cattle. But never, not once, did silence fall so heavy as when the truth beneath a simple burlap sack was revealed. The rival shoved forward, spittle flying from his lips as he shouted, "She's mine!" But the cowboy just stepped between them. His shadow stretched long and dark across the dirt. The crowd leaned in, hungry for the clash they knew was coming. The girl clutched her bound hands to her chest, her lips trembling. Her voice was no more than a prayer lost in the wind. "You shouldn't have seen me." And in that breath, the whole square seemed to hold still, waiting for a blow to be struck, waiting for a word to be said. But the cowboy's silence promised a storm. The rival rancher's face was a twisted mask of fury. He pointed a shaking finger at the girl, his voice booming over the tense hush that had fallen over the square. "You think she's yours because you paid a coin? That sack should have stayed over her head. She's nothing but disgrace." The words ignited a few cruel laughs. Women pulled their shawls tighter, whispering behind their hands. Men smirked, nudging one another. The crowd was feeding on her humiliation like vultures circling carrion. The auctioneer puffed out his chest, letting out a wheezy laugh. "Stranger, you've been cheated. Could have had a strong girl, good hips, clear eyes, but you chose the cursed one. A coin wasted, I say." The girl flinched as though each word was a physical blow. She lowered her gaze, but that fire of defiance still smoldered beneath her lashes. Wet with tears, she refused to let fall. And all the while the cowboy stood silent. His jaw was set like stone. His hands rested easy at his belt, as though the mockery of the entire town could not move him an inch. Elias Red Feather. In the old days, silence could be a shield as strong as any steel. A man who held his tongue often held his ground, and those who jeered soon found their laughter turning hollow in their own throats. The rival took another step forward. His boots kicked dust across the girl's bare feet. He sneered, his voice low and venomous. "You think you can hide behind him? You'll be back in my barn before the night's over." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. You could taste the promise of a fight hanging in the hot, still air. The girl whimpered, a tiny, broken sound. "Please don't let him." Her plea was cut short. The cowboy reached into his pocket. Slow, deliberate, and he dropped another coin onto the ground between them. The metallic clink rang out like a gunshot, startling the last of the laughter into dead silence. He said nothing. He only fixed his eyes on the rival rancher, a gaze so steady it pinned the man in place like a nail driven into wood. The rival hesitated, his swagger faltering for just a second. But pride was a powerful thing, and it would not let him retreat. He spat into the dust. "She's not worth even that." The cowboy bent down. He scooped the coin back up, the metal warm from the sun. And he pressed it into the girl's bound hands, curling her trembling fingers tight around it. "She's worth more than all of you," he said at last. His voice was low, steady, and utterly unshaken. The words fell heavy into the square. They cracked the crowd's sneers like brittle glass. The girl's eyes filled, tears trembling on her bruised skin, as if hope itself, a thing she'd long forgotten, had just been placed into her palm. The rival recoiled, his face blotchy and red with rage. But the cowboy's silence returned, iron and immovable. And the crowd leaned in again, knowing the moment hadn't passed. It had only just begun. The real fight had not yet been decided. The rival rancher lunged, his hand shot out, reaching to seize the girl's arm, to drag her from the block. But the cowboy moved quicker. He stepped between them with a quiet force that made the big rancher stumble backward, landing hard in the dust. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Half of them expected the sheriff to intervene, to put a stop to it. But no badge appeared. There were only the townsfolk, hungry for the spectacle of two men circling over a trembling girl, a single coin still clutched tight in her bound hands. The rival sneered, brushing the dirt from his fancy vest. He hissed through clenched teeth, "You can't just take her." He paused, letting his words hang in the air. "She's been promised." The words tightened around the girl's throat like a noose. Her lips parted in a weak gasp, as though a shame she thought was hidden had just been dragged out for all the world to see. The cowboy didn't flinch. He reached down, lifted the frayed sack from the ground where it had fallen, and dropped it gently into her lap. His calmness only seemed to fuel the rival's rage. Elias Red Feather. Promises in the West were often carved by men who owned more cattle than compassion. And when those promises broke, it was always the powerless who bled for it. The girl's fingers trembled against the coin and the rough burlap of the sack. Her voice was so faint it nearly vanished into the dust. "You shouldn't have seen me," she whispered again. Her eyes were fixed on the bruises that the sack had failed to hide, as if the world had been a safer place when she was faceless. The rival barked a laugh. "She speaks the truth for once. Cover her up, cowboy, before you regret it." The cowboy said nothing. He only lifted her by the elbow, his touch firm but gentle, and guided her down the steps of the auction block. Murmurs swelled around them like a rising tide. The rival shouted after him, his voice echoing across the square. "She's mine by law and by blood, and I'll drag her back before sunrise." But his words only fanned the crowd's hunger for conflict. Their whispers became a storm, building and building above the dusty square. The girl stumbled as her feet met the ground. Her body was weak, but she clutched the sack tight against her chest as though it alone was holding her upright. The cowboy steadied her with one strong arm and kept walking, his boots pounding a steady rhythm into the silence he carried like armor. They reached his wagon. The old leather creaked as he lifted her onto the worn bench. Her breaths came in shallow, frightened gasps. She pressed the sack to her chest, her eyes wide. She whispered, "It hides more than my face." His eyes flicked to the bundle in her arms. You could see a flicker of curiosity spark beneath his calm exterior. But he only snapped the reins, driving the horses forward. Behind them, the rival rancher was shouting curses, words that clung to the hot air like smoke. His threats promised pursuit. The wagon rattled out of town, dust rising in a plume behind them. The crowd slowly dispersed, but every whisper, every glance carried the same unspoken question. What secret did that sack still hold, that even she, the girl who bore its shame, begged him not to see? The wagon rattled over ruts and stones. Each jolt tugged at the girl's frail body as she sat, stiff and silent beside the cowboy. Her bruised face was turned toward the barren horizon, and the burlap sack trembled in her arms. The noise of the town had faded behind them, but its laughter still lingered in her ears. Every cruel whisper echoed louder than the creak of the wagon wheels. She clutched the bundle so tightly her knuckles whitened. Her breath was shallow, her shoulders bent, as if the weight of the sack pressed down on her more heavily than any iron chain. The cowboy guided the reins with steady hands. His jaw was hard, his silence as firm and unyielding as the worn leather seat beneath them. Elias Redfeather. On the long, lonely roads of the West, words often fled, leaving only the sound of hooves on dry earth and the burden of secrets that no wind could carry away. She spoke at last. Her voice was dry and ragged. "It's not my face they hate. It's what's in here." Her fingers dug into the burlap as though the fabric itself burned her to the touch. He kept his eyes on the trail ahead. The leather reins were taut in his hands. His voice came low and steady. "Then let me carry it." She shook her head violently, pressing the sack tighter to her chest. Her breath hitched as though she feared even the air might try to steal it from her. "No, you don't understand. If it rips, if they see, it'll kill what little is left of me." The wagon jolted hard. A wheel clattered into a deep rut, throwing her forward. He caught her arm before she could fall. His grip was firm but careful. For a moment their eyes met, hers wide with a deep, consuming terror, his dark with a patience that did not bend or break. The horses strained. The path had narrowed, running along the edge of a steep canyon. The earth crumbled in patches just beyond the wheels. The drop yawned open beside them, a throat full of jagged rocks waiting far below. She gasped, clutching the sack as though she'd rather tumble with it into the abyss than let it go. The cowboy drew the reins hard, steadying the team, his muscles taut as the wagon lurched dangerously. Dust swirled around them. The canyon wind whipped past like a whispered warning. Then a sharp crack echoed through the air. A wooden spoke on the wheel closest to the edge had splintered. The wagon shuddered, teetering, tilting toward the canyon's lip. They were one wrong move, one panicked breath, away from tumbling into ruin. She cried out, curling her body protectively around the sack. He leapt down from the wagon, his boots skidding against the loose dirt. His hands grappled for the broken wheel, his shoulders strained, his breath coming in heavy bursts as he shoved against the tilting wood, trying to wedge a rock beneath it. The girl pressed her forehead to the rough burlap of the sack, whispering through her tears, "Don't let it fall. Please don't let it break." And as the wheel creaked and groaned under his grip, the question hung as sharp and clear as the canyon air. What secret inside that sack could possibly be worth more than her life itself? The wheel groaned. The cowboy shoved the rock tight beneath it, his muscles burning with the strain. Dust clouded his boots while the horses tossed their heads in panic, their eyes rolling. At last, the wagon steadied. Its weight settled with a long sigh, like the land itself had finally released a breath it had been holding. He wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of his sleeve. He rose slowly and glanced up at the girl who still sat frozen on the bench. Her arms were curled around the sack as though it were her very heartbeat, her only reason for living. The burlap had torn in the struggle. A jagged rip ran down one side, and through the gap something glimmered faintly in the fading light. He climbed back up onto the wagon seat. His eyes were drawn to the torn seam. He reached out a hand gently. His voice was low. "What are you hiding in there?" She flinched, pulling the bundle tighter against her. But as she did, the tear widened. A small wooden toy tumbled out and landed in his lap. It was a carved horse. Its paint was chipped and faded. One of its tiny ears was broken off. It was the sort of treasure a child would hold on to through every storm, every dark night. Elias Red Feather. In the West, a toy was never just a toy. It was the echo of a child's laughter. It was the memory of hands too small to protect themselves from the world's cruelty. The cowboy turned the small figure over in his rough palm. The grooves of the carving were worn smooth by tiny, clinging fingers. He looked at her, his eyes searching her face. Whose was it? She shook her head, a violent, desperate motion. Tears streamed down her face, cutting paths through the dust on her cheeks. "Don't ask me. Don't make me say it." Her voice cracked under the weight of words she had held inside for too long. She pressed the sack tighter, her body trembling as though she could still hold the rest of its secrets locked away inside. He set the toy gently back into her lap. His voice was quiet but unyielding. "Secrets rot when you bury them. One day they rise." She gasped, covering the toy with her trembling hands. She whispered, "It's all I have left of them. If they knew, they would tear even that from me." Before he could press her further, a sound came from down the trail behind them. The thunder of hooves. Dust rose in a cloud, a long shadow falling across the canyon road. When the cowboy looked back, his eyes narrowed. A cluster of riders was approaching, moving fast. They were led by the rival rancher. Their faces were hard masks of malice, their horses foaming at the mouth with the speed of the pursuit. The girl stiffened. She clutched the sack so tightly the burlap strained anew. Her tears fell hot onto the little wooden toy in her lap. The cowboy reached for the rifle slung behind the seat. His jaw was clenched tight as he murmured, "They've come for you, and for what you're carrying." The girl's sob broke into a desperate prayer. The sack trembled in her arms, and the canyon echoed with the thunder of hooves, closing in fast, promising that the secret she guarded so fiercely would soon be torn wide open for all the world to see. The canyon walls funneled the sound of hooves. It felt like the earth itself was shaking, each echo bouncing between stone and sky as the rival rancher and his men bore down on the crippled wagon. The girl shrank against the bench. She was clutching the sack so tightly, her nails cut through the burlap, biting into her own skin. Her eyes were wide with terror. The cowboy stepped down into the road. He raised the rifle, his silhouette framed against the jagged cliffs. A single man standing in the path of half a dozen riders. The rival reined in his stallion with a hard, cruel yank. Dust swirled around him as he sneered, "Hand her over, and maybe I'll let you keep your hide." His men laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. They circled like wolves, their pistols gleaming in the dimming light. The girl's voice cracked as she cried out, "Don't let them take it." She pressed the sack against her chest, rocking back and forth like a mother shielding her child, her body trembling with a desperate, hopeless energy. The rival pointed a gloved hand at her. His words cut through the air like a whip. "Everyone knows what she hides. A bastard's shame, born of sin. Tear it open and show the world what she really is, Elias Redfeather. Cruelty is never content with whispers. It craves a spectacle. Shame is only satisfying when it's bared for others to feast their eyes upon. The cowboy's jaw hardened. His voice rolled low and steady like a distant storm cloud. She's not yours, and what she carries is none of your claim. The rival smirked, spitting into the dirt. Then I'll claim it myself. With a sudden lunge, he spurred his horse forward. He swiped at the sack with the end of his reins. The girl screamed, twisting away. But the burlap tore wide open under the strike. Its contents spilled across the dust. Out tumbled scraps of worn cloth, a ribbon dulled by dirt, and the little carved horse, its chipped ear catching the last of the sun's light. The rival leaned down from his saddle and scooped the toy from the ground. He held it aloft with a look of cruel delight. "So this is your treasure, a dead child's plaything." He dangled it before his riders, his laughter sharp as a freshly honed blade. The girl collapsed to her knees in the wagon bed. Her hands clawed at the dusty floorboards as though she could somehow bury the shame back into the earth. Her sobs were raw, ragged sounds that raked at her chest. The cowboy's eyes narrowed. His finger tightened against the rifle's trigger. The silence between heartbeats was suddenly louder than all the jeers. The rival grinned, lifting the toy higher for all to see. He spat the words out like poison. "Worthless, just like her." The canyon air seemed to crackle with the weight of the moment. The girl's cries were breaking like glass against the stone cliffs. And in the terrible hush that followed, one question thundered louder than any stampede of hooves. Would the cowboy fire? Or would he find another way to save her from the ruin that was already spilling out across the dust? The rival dangled the toy high, his laughter bouncing cruelly off the canyon walls. But in that heartbeat, the cowboy moved. His rifle swung, but not to kill, to strike. The wooden butt of the rifle slammed against the rival's wrist with a sickening crack that sent the carved horse tumbling back into the dirt. The rival roared in pain, clutching his hand. His horse reared violently, its front hooves lashing the air, nearly unseating him. Chaos rippled through his men as they scrambled to steady their own spooked mounts. The cowboy seized the moment. He grabbed the girl's trembling arm, hauling her upright. "Hold on," he growled. He shoved her back into the wagon seat before leaping up beside her. He cracked the reins and the horses bolted forward, the broken wheels screaming in protest. The wheels skidded dangerously close to the canyon's edge. Dust rose like a thick curtain, covering their desperate flight. The girl pressed the torn sack tight against her body. Its pathetic secrets, ribbons and scraps of cloth, were spilling out into the rushing wind. She gasped, clutching the little toy horse as if her very soul lived inside its chipped wooden frame. Her tears were blinding her to the treacherous road ahead. "They'll never stop," she whispered, her voice raw with despair. Elias Redfeather. Fear will drive a heart faster than any horse, but it cannot outrun the truth that always gallops close behind. The rival was shouting curses from somewhere in the dust cloud, his men spurring their horses forward. But the canyon was widening, opening up to the outskirts of town. The rooftops glinted in the distance. The cowboy leaned hard into the reins, his voice cutting through the thunder of their escape. "We'll reach the church. They won't dare drag you out from under God's roof." The wagon careened onto the main road. Townsfolk scattered, shouting in alarm as the dust and hooves swallowed the street. Faces turned, whispers ignited. A crowd was already starting to thicken, drawn by the chaotic sight of a girl clutching a torn sack and a cowboy whose silence carried more power than a dozen loaded pistols. The wagon screeched to a halt before the stone steps of the church. The horses were frothing, their sides heaving. The cowboy lifted her down with one arm, just as the rival and his men thundered in behind them, blocking their path. The girl stumbled, clutching the sack to her chest. Her sobs were cracking through the tense air of the square. She collapsed on the first step, rocking back and forth as she whispered, "It wasn't mine to keep. It was never mine." The cowboy knelt beside her. His hand hovered over her shoulder, not quite touching. His eyes were steady on hers. Then whose was it? Her breath hitched, and at last the words spilled out of her like blood from a wound. "My sister's child. She's gone. And I swore they'd never shame her name. So I carried it all. I carried it all alone." Gasps rippled through the gathering crowd. Their jeers and whispers were replaced with uneasy murmurs, and then the heavy church doors creaked open. A long shadow stretched out across the square. The sheriff stood framed in the doorway. His hand was resting on the butt of his revolver. His voice was hard as iron. "This has gone far enough. Tell the truth, or I'll take it from you myself." The girl clutched the sack tighter. Her whole body was trembling as the crowd pressed closer, their hunger for revelation rising again like a tide. She could not possibly hope to hold back. The sheriff's boots echoed down the stone church steps as he advanced. His shadow fell long across the dust. His eyes narrowed on the torn sack clutched against the girl's chest. The rival rancher straightened in his saddle, his voice dripping with triumph. "There's your law, stranger. Make her spill it. Let the whole town see what she's been hiding." Murmurs rose like a tide through the square. Faces pressed closer. Mothers shielded their children's eyes with one hand, while still craning their necks to see. Men started whispering wagers on whether shame or defiance would win the day. The girl shivered. Her bruised face was streaked with tears and dust. Her lips trembled as though the weight of the whole town was bearing down on her small frame. She pressed the sack tighter, rocking as she whispered, "If they know, they'll take even this." Elias Redfeather. Lawmen in those days were not always the keepers of justice. Sometimes they were just the guardians of a difficult silence, because the truth was often heavier than the badge they wore. The sheriff stopped right in front of her. His hand hovered above his revolver. His voice was low and cold. "Speak it plain. What's inside that sack?" The girl bowed her head, her voice breaking. "It belonged to my sister's child. She died, and I could not let the town spit on her grave, so I carried the shame instead." A gasp ran through the crowd like a wind through dry grass. Women clutched their mouths. Men shifted uneasily, as if the air itself had suddenly turned heavier. The rival laughed, a sound that was sharp and cruel. "So she admits it, a bastard's relic, hidden like its treasure. Burn it, Sheriff. Let her watch it all turn to ash." The sheriff hesitated. His eyes flicked from the girl's trembling form to the cowboy standing firm at her side. The rifle was slung over his shoulder, but he was ready. His jaw was a line of iron. The crowd pressed closer still, their hunger for a final, terrible act rising. The sheriff's hand tightened on his gun, but then he reached for the sack instead. With a single harsh motion, he yanked it free from her grasp. He lifted it high for all to see. Its meager contents tumbled into the dust, scraps of cloth, a faded ribbon, the carved horse gleaming dull in the harsh sunlight. The rivals sneered, shouting, "There! Worthless trinkets for a worthless girl!" The sheriff tossed the bundle toward the waiting flames of a torch, held by one of the rival's men. His voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "Best to end it here. No more whispers. No more lies." The girl screamed. She reached out with both arms as the sack sailed through the air, toward the fire. Her voice tore through the square, a sound of pure agony. "No, it's all I had left of them." The cowboy's hand shot forward, catching her arm just before she collapsed. His eyes were blazing as he moved. The crowd's gasp rose into a roar. The flames snapped hungrily. And in that one suspended breath, the question hung in the air. Would he let it burn, or would he seize it from the fire and defy the whole town's verdict? The torchlight flickered, hungry and bright. Its flames licked at the edge of the burlap as the sack landed against it. The crowd leaned forward as one body, their faces alight with the cruel thrill of a public ruin. But before the fire could claim it, the cowboy surged forward. His boots struck the boards of the square with the sound of thunder. His arm cut through the smoke and heat as he snatched the sack from the blaze. Sparks scattered, searing his sleeve, but he did not falter, did not even flinch. He turned, holding the bundle high above his head. Its scorched threads were glowing faintly. His voice rang out with a power that silenced even the jeering rival. This is not shame. This is memory, and this is hers to keep. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some people lowered their eyes. Others shifted uneasily, the weight of his words pressing down upon them. The rival's face darkened with rage. His voice broke as he spat. "You'd ruin yourself for her. You think this town will forget what she carried?" The cowboy stepped away from the flames. He placed the charred sack back into the girl's trembling arms. His hand was steady as he guided hers to clutch it close. "I didn't buy her," he said, his voice low but cutting through the silence. "I freed her, Elias Redfeather." There are moments when a man's silence finally breaks into thunder. And the truth carried in that thunder can shake walls that mockery and cruelty could never hope to reach. The girl's sobs caught in her throat. Her tears were spilling anew as she looked up at him, her lips trembling with a disbelief that was painful to watch. "You'd keep me, even knowing what they say?" He met her gaze, his own firm and unwavering. "I know enough. I know what it cost you to carry another's burden. That makes you stronger than all of them." He bent down and picked up the small carved horse from the dust. He held it in his palm for a moment, his thumb tracing the worn, smooth wood. Then his eyes narrowed. He saw something on its belly, something carved there, small and faint. He held it out to the sheriff. "Look closer." The sheriff took the toy. He squinted, turning it over in the light. Carved into the underside were two initials, R.H. The rival rancher's name was Randall Hayes. A murmur went through the crowd as the sheriff held up the toy. "Randall, these your initials?" The rival's face went pale. He stammered, "It's a common carving. It means nothing." But the sheriff wasn't looking at him. He was looking at the girl. "The child," he said, his voice softer now. "Was it his?" The girl nodded, tears streaming down her face. "He promised my sister the world. Then he left her with nothing. He never even saw his own child." The crowd turned as one. Their stares, once filled with scorn for her, were now fixed on the rival rancher. Their whispers shifted from laughter to a low, angry hum. Randall Hayes lunged forward, his face a mask of fury, but the townsfolk drew back from him. They were no longer eager for his spectacle. One by one they lowered their eyes, their faces filled with a shame of their own. Even the sheriff took a slow step back from him, his hand now resting on his gun for a different reason. The rival roared, "You'll regret this, both of you." But his voice rang hollow in the silence that followed, his threats scattered like dust in the wind. The girl clutched the sack tighter. Her body was still trembling, but in her eyes something new was flickering. Hope. Fragile but alive. The cowboy placed himself before her, his shoulders broad, his stance unyielding. And together they stood while the crowd began to turn away, their appetite for cruelty finally quenched by a truth they could not deny. As the rival stumbled back to his horse, humiliated before the very people who once cheered him on, the square held its breath one last time, waiting for the dawn that would decide whether love or shame would have the final word. The dawn crept slow and pale across the rooftops. The square was empty of its cruelty now. Only ashes smoldered where the torch had burned, and the sound of a single shamed horseman faded into the hills. The girl sat on the church steps. The sack was clutched in her lap. Its fabric was scorched, but it had been mended with strips of leather the cowboy had stitched through the long night. Her fingers traced the seams, trembling over the crude but sturdy repair. For the first time in years, her chest lifted with a breath that was not stolen by fear. The cowboy stood before her, his hat in his hand. The rising light cast his frame tall and strong against the quiet street. He crouched low, his voice rough but gentle, the kind of voice that carried weight because it carried no lies. "It's safe now, not because it's whole, but because it's yours." She lifted her eyes to him. The bruises were still raw, but in their depths flickered a softness that had been buried deep beneath years of shame. "You don't understand," she whispered. Her hand tightened on the toy horse that peeked from the sack's mended edge. "This was never mine. It was my sister's child's. I kept it so they'd spit on me, not on her grave. Elias Red Feather. There are burdens men will never carry, for only a woman's heart can cradle another's ruin and call it mercy." She pressed the toy into his palm, her voice shaking. "I don't know how to stop carrying it." He closed his hand over hers, his eyes steady. "Then let me carry it with you." She wept then, silent sobs that broke loose like rivers after a long drought. Her shoulders shook as she buried her face against the mended sack. The cowboy lifted her gently, guiding her toward the wagon where the horses waited, their breath misting in the cool of the morning. As he helped her climb aboard, the rivals' threats lingered in the air like ghosts, but the crowd's judgment had vanished. It was replaced by whispers that trembled with something entirely different. Respect. The sack lay on the seat between them as the wagon rolled out of the square. The little wooden horse glinted faintly in the sunlight. It was no longer a mark of shame, but a symbol of survival, of a love that had been carried through fire and ruin. The girl leaned into his shoulder, her voice barely audible above the creak of the wheels. "You could have let it burn." He looked down at her, his arms settling around her thin frame. "Some things are too sacred to let the flames have." The road stretched out ahead, the sun climbed higher in the sky, and the world seemed new, a place where memory no longer shackled the heart, but healed it. Elias Red Feather. And so it was that a sack once filled with sorrow became the vessel of dignity, mended by hands that chose mercy over mockery. I am Elias Red Feather, and this story, like the dust of the trail, lingers long after the footsteps have passed. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more tales from the Forgotten West. Now I have a question for you. If you had been there and the sheriff ordered that sack burned, would you have reached into the fire too? Tell us in the comments below.